So you've been thinking about your topic and your audience, and you've come up with an idea for a visual aid that you think will be great. It'll convey what you need to convey. It has the use that you want it to, and you think it'll work for your topic, the speech, yourself, and the audience. But how should you actually put that visual aid together? What are some guidelines or things you want to think about? Well, that is the subject of this video. So when you're preparing and presenting visual aids, there are some things that you need to think about. Don't just walk in with a poster you made 5 minutes before and chuck it up and go, here you go. That's not going to work, all right? You need to think about these things ahead of time. So when you are preparing visual aids, first and foremost, prepare it well in advance, okay? There's several reasons for this. One, you may think something's going to work, and then when you actually get into using it and practicing with it or putting it together, discover, oh, I didn't think of this, or this isn't working as well as I thought, need to change it up. You also want to prepare in advance so that you can practice with it. Don't walk in there to give a speech with a PowerPoint or a poster that you've never practiced with before. Remember, the whole point of, you're going to be nervous when you give a speech. The whole point of practice is to reduce newness. Because the more comfortable you feel, the more practiced and prepared you feel, the less nervous you will be. And doing something brand new for the first time tends to increase people's speech anxiety. That's already high with most people anyway. So prepare them in advance so they look polished, they're well done, and you have a chance to practice with them. You also want to keep them simple. Don't do some kind of crazy complex visual aid. That old acronym of KISS, keep it simple, stupid, applies a lot to visual aids, especially PowerPoint, that we'll talk about in a bit. And you want to be sure when you're putting these together, you use fonts effectively. Now, I want to talk a bit about fonts because they're something that I see abused a lot. And now this goes heavily with PowerPoint, which is something that I recommend a lot of people use for several reasons. Because one big thing with visual aids is you want to be sure they're big enough that the audience can see it. You run into problems with that with things like posters. Because I promise you, getting a piece of poster board from Walmart and printing out a couple of pictures on your home printer and cutting them out and gluing them to the poster board is not going to work. Why? They're not going to be big enough. People in the back won't be able to see it. Doing them in PowerPoint works effectively. But you want to use the fonts effectively when putting it together. And what I mean by this, one of the great things about PowerPoint is that it has a lot of features built in it that allow you to kind of express yourself and be creative. One of the bad things about PowerPoint is it has all these features built into it that allows you to express yourself and be creative. And that's not always a good thing, especially when it comes to PowerPoints and visual aids in a speech. And fonts is a big part of that. So take a look at this list. So here on one side, you see a list of fonts that we would say are ineffective versus the other side that are more effective. Now, what would you say in one or two words is the primary difference between these two things, these two categories? Some people are like, well, how they look, yeah. But I would say the ones that are ineffective, we would probably classify as artistic. And so if you were creating a slide to be artistic, that was the whole point, those might work, okay? But not for a visual aid in a speech. Remember, it's not there to replace you. It is there to enhance your message. So being able to see it clearly is what's going to be the best option. All right, the bane of my existence in education is Schoolhouse. Because a lot of people like to use it because it's like a board, but the problem is you do a whole slide in Schoolhouse, especially if you're sitting towards the back of the room, those lines just keep coming at you and they distract from your ability to read it. Okay, because what makes those fonts more effective are things like the spacing between the letters to make it more legible. For example, look at the spacing difference between those letters between Courier and Eccentric. You see, the ones in Eccentric are a lot more closer together. That's because it's trying to be artistic. Whereas the effective ones, they're designed to be read easily. So a rule of thumb I would always say is if you haven't seen the font used in a book or magazine, don't use it in a PowerPoint. If you ever picked up a book in like Barnes & Noble that was written in rosewood or in cracked, maybe the cover art, but the actual stuff inside, no. Because the primary rule with fonts is legibility first. You're not trying to be artistic. You want the audience to be able to easily read it. Fonts matter. And you want to stay away from using artistic fonts because sometimes they can create messages that you didn't intend. For example, how many of you would like to join me for a great lunch at Fart Taco? Now, obviously, this is Fast Taco. But you see the font choice they've used with the R? You see how you might look at it and see Fart Taco? And I don't think any of us would like to go eat at a Fart Taco. Now, that's kind of a comical example, but let's look at an example of how much of a difference this font choice makes within a PowerPoint, okay? So this is an example of a PowerPoint with all the logical fallacies on it. Now, normally I wouldn't use this as too much stuff on it, but just for the example, has all the logical fallacies we teach in public speaking on it, all right? Now, this is in your standard Courier type of font. Now, watch what happens to the clarity when I change just the font. Now, before I switch slides, I want you to understand, I have not changed size at all. They're the same size on both slides, all right? So here's the legible font. There's the artistic font. Legible, artistic. Which would you rather look at for 10 to 15 minutes? This or that? This, because you can clearly see it and it makes sense. You probably can't even make out half of what these are. All right, so stay away from artistic fonts. Use clear, legible font choices when you're doing things like PowerPoint. The audience will thank you for it, I promise. Now, what about some other things? Well, we talked about preparing in advance, keeping it simple, and using fonts effectively. Something else to think about, this is also big with PowerPoints, is you want to use color effectively, okay? You don't just want to pick any colors. You want to pick colors, again, that create a visual environment, if you will, that is pleasing to the audience's eye as far as reading, as far as seeing what's up there, all right? Remember, this isn't an advertising campaign. It's not some big full-page ad in a magazine. It's a PowerPoint visual aid about your topic in a speech, okay? So, effective colors. 1, high contrast. You noticed, and you'll see this throughout all the videos in this course, I use black backgrounds with white letters. Why? Watched a great video. It's linked in this course by a guy named David J.P. Phillips talking about good PowerPoints. And this is one of the things he recommends. Why? It's high contrast. You want to use dark backgrounds with light colors. It makes it easy to see. Don't use white backgrounds. It's too bright, distracts from yourself, okay? High contrast in colors, fonts that are easy to see, and use a limited number of stuff, limited number of sizes. Your PowerPoint should not look like Crayola threw up all over it. Shouldn't look like Microsoft Word threw up all over it. And for the most part, you want to keep it consistent across your slides. You don't want one slide to be blue and red, the next one black and white, and the next one orange and pink. That's just not going to work, all right? And again, color matters. Because again, if you use too much color, get too creative, you can wind up putting out a message you didn't intend, something like this. Now, this is a secondhand kids clothing store that's called Kids Exchange. Okay, you probably see this a lot where people take their baby clothes after their kids have grown up and then they resell them. But how many of you saw something else like Kids Exchange? Because of the use of color, it pops out that way. That's not what they're intending, but that might be what you see. So you want to keep that in mind as far as color choices. So now that we've talked about some font and color choices you want to think about when putting them together, what are some tips when you're actually presenting them? Well, number one, make sure you display them where the listeners can see them. This is one of the reasons why I do like PowerPoint, because it makes it big enough and up high enough that people can see it. Don't have it propped on the floor. As I spoke about in a previous video, don't like, this is an iPhone and da-da-da. People aren't going to be able to see that. So make sure you put it where people can see it. Also, as we've mentioned before, don't pass things out. Don't pass out stuff before you start talking. Don't pass out stuff while you're talking. It's an invitation to distraction. It's not going to be effective for the vast majority of the audience. And it's just inviting people to start doodling or whatnot. Fine to give it after, and it's okay to tell them, I will provide you a copy of this after I'm done. And a lot of people would like that with things like PowerPoint. But Don't do it ahead of time. It's just calling attention away from you. I mean, honestly, how many of y'all ever got a PowerPoint in class before the instructor talked about it and you spent most of class just reading the PowerPoint and doodling on it instead of paying attention? Because I know I'm guilty of that. Again, if you would do it, you can't expect your audience to be any different. Okay, only display your visual aid when you're discussing it. If you're using a poster, put it up. When you're talking about it, then put it down. This is one of the reasons why you don't pass things out, because for the vast majority of people, when they get it, you're not going to be talking about it. Same is true in PowerPoint, and I mentioned this before. A great tool for this in PowerPoint is to put in blank slides. I tend to put in either a blank black or a blank dark blue slide. Because maybe if I'm giving a 10-minute speech, maybe I'm done talking about one slide at 2:15, but I don't get to the next slide, like maybe it's a picture, until 4 minutes. Well, I don't want to have that slide just hanging up there, for over a minute when I'm not talking about it. So I move to the blank slide, keep going, and then when I get to the picture, then I advance. So that's a great simple technique that you can use. Also, don't just put it up there and people will figure it out. No, anything you show, you want to explain what the point of it is, all right? So what are some other tips for presenting the visual aids? Well, one, remember, talk to your audience, not a visual aid. And this is a problem people have with posters. They'll have a poster and they talk like this. It's really bad with PowerPoint because they'll have it up here and they do this the whole time and they look and they roll back and then they look and roll back. No. This is your audience. That's your visual aid. You need to look at the audience. Okay. If you made this thing ahead of time and practiced it, pulled it up and checked it before you started, I promise you, techno gremlins are not going to go in and mess with it during your speech. That's why I mentioned before, if I've used PowerPoints to have a printout in slide view that I can kind of go through, or handout view that I can go through and I can keep in track of where I'm at and I look at that, I can glance and do it that way. It's one thing that to switch, you just take a quick glance to make sure it's up, but look at your audience, not the visual aid. Practice with your visual aid. I know I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. You're trying to reduce newness when you give a speech in class or anywhere. So make sure you've practiced with the visual aid ahead of time. You know when to do what with it. You know when to put it up, when to put it down, and you are comfortable with it. And if you're using something like PowerPoint or video, check the room and equipment before you start. Biggest thing with this, make sure the volume's on. Every semester, I have at least a handful of students that go to show a video and they hit play and there's no sound. And they have to start narrating the video. And it's because they didn't just really quickly before they started talking, pull up YouTube and go play on any random video. Play, sound working? Okay. But you want to be sure that's working. If you're giving it in a place you don't have control of, make sure you ask, what'll I have? What'll be there? And if something's not working, how do I get a hold of IT to help? So you get there early, make sure the PowerPoint projector works. You can use the computer, and if something's not, you can contact IT. Simple things that you can do. Don't just go in and assume everything's working. That's begging for success. Sorry, that's begging to just fail. I got those backwards, but still, you get the point. Okay, so those are some basic guidelines for putting together and how to use a visual aid as far as where to put it and things to think about. So good guidelines to follow, and hopefully you use these and you'll quit as I used to do. We don't want to abuse our audience with our visual aids, and these can help you do that. So like I've said before, a visual aid can significantly help improve the overall effect of your speech, but only when it's done effectively. So by combining the information we learned in the using visual aids video with the content about presentation and putting them together from this video, you'll definitely be set up to give a great visual aid with your speech and overall elevate your message and your presentation.